What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation. The Land of Blades, an isolated place where few from the elemental nations dare go. At the present it is little more than a patchwork quilt of warring states. Each trying to assert superiority over their neighbors, and then the entire land. However, it was not always like this. Long ago, in the time of the Riduko Sennin, the Land of Blades was united under one ruler, the Golden Emperor. Little is known about this near-mythical ruler, but what is known is a mix of lies and truth. Some say the emperor was a benevolent ruler with nothing but the best interests of his empire at heart. Others say he was a tyrant who was more monster than man. But what is true is that without the emperor the land fell apart, splitting into numerous warring factions. The two biggest factions have been in a state of constant warfare for the past 100 years. The principalities of Xi'an and Belka, or France and England as they were once known. In fact, one of the numerous skirmishes that had occurred over the last 100 years is happening right now. Land of Blades. Border between Xi'an and Belka. Two lines of soldiers in armor were drawn up on opposite sides of a north-south running valley. The lines were made of everything from peasants with spears to knights on horseback. The side on the west had red trim on their armor and clothes while the eastern side had blue. The two sides were glaring at each other, until at some unknown signal the knights charged at each other. The other forces quickly began to fight as well, except for one group of blue-trimmed soldiers. Their commander, who had an open-faced helmet and was clad in chainmail armor, then turned to them while lifting his long sword and spoke in a slight Cockney accent, "Forward and to battle." The unit charged forward and encountered another unit of similarly armed red-trimmed soldiers. The captain of that unit was dressed in padded and spiked leather armor with an open-faced conical helm that had a noseguard. He too was armed with a long sword. The captains recognized each other as soon as they crossed blades. The blue-trimmed one spoke first. Were you not with the Xionic forces?" The red-garbed captain then responded as he pushed away before attacking yet again. He spoke with a slight Xionic accent but in a deeper voice. 3 battles ago certainly. Now I fight for Belka." The two were still fighting while all around them soldiers and knights died from any number of causes. Everything from sword wounds to arrows to primitive gunshots. As they clashed again and started to struggle for dominance, the red-garbed captain spoke again. "Xi'an, Belka, or any of the other warring factions in this land. I go wherever the coin is greatest. That is the life of a mercenary." The Xi'an-serving mercenary spoke in a slightly tired voice. "There's no right or wrong anymore." The Belkan-serving merc then spoke with slight amusement. "Indeed. The sun doth continue to rise and afterwards set, and yet it seems as if time itself doth stand still. Unfortunately, before we can see the end of the battle the field fades away, covered in dust and smoke. Sparked into existence by the conflict over the true heir to the throne of Xi'an, one of the primary principalities within the Land of Blades. A brutal conflict has lasted for almost 100 years. This conflict is not an isolated incident either. The entire Land of Blades has been in conflict over who would rule the provinces and ultimately the Land of Blades itself. Each side in these wars has exhausted themselves and now need to rely on the cunning, skill, heroism, and in some cases sheer ruthlessness of mercenaries. Now one more intrepid soul resolves to enter this land of bloodshed and death to end the seemingly eternal war that racks the land. But our story doesn't begin with tales of heroism, victory, and sacrifice. No, it starts with one of the blackest days in the history of Konoha. The day of Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze's banishment for succeeding in returning Sasuke Uchiha, the last scion of the famed Uchiha clan. Konoha's council chambers. The day immediately after the Sasuke retrieval mission. The chambers were in an uproar. In the center of the chamber in chains was Naruto Uzumaki. He had to be supported by 2 Anbu loyal only to the Hokage because of how weak he was after waking up that morning, getting 2 Chidoris to the gut and then walking back from the Valley of the End while carrying an unconscious Uchiha can do that to a person. Around the chamber were the clan heads, the civilian council, the elders, and the Gademi Hokage, Tsunade Senju. But besides the whole Naruto in chains bit, it was pretty much an ordinary meeting. The civilians and elders demanding Naruto's head on a silver platter or his exile for hurting the Uchiha. That was a new one, but the others, like for being a demon, being uncontrollable, or just disrespectful, were old ones. But all Naruto could think of was, blah, blah, blah. They're really idiotic for underestimating the Yondaime's expertise and the power of the Shinigami, aren't they? I mean, really, you must be retarded to think a god couldn't hold a seal together and do his job. Bah, not like they'll win this time if they haven't already. The clans and Hokage shooting the idiots down at every turn. But this time the civilians and elders had a trump card. One that they all too gleefully played. I'm afraid that the decision is out of your hands, Tsunade. Danzo said with a slight sneer. The fire daimyo agrees with us that the boy is too dangerous to even have in the land of fire. Instead of execution like we wanted, though, he is to be banished for all eternity from the land of fire, upon pain of death if he ever returns. The clans, Tsunade, and the few friends he had who were watching what was happening were horrified at this turn of events. Tsunade looked about ready to start a killing spree. But a mirthless chuckle from Naruto froze her in her tracks. It was such an alien sound to come from the blonde throat that she had to make sure that she wasn't hearing things. Naruto, once he finished chuckling, gained a look which was of a man who had seen it all, and done it all, before speaking. I know why you're exiling me. He said in such a calm tone that it froze the blood of those present. He then pointed at the elders. It's not about the Kyuubi for you elders, although it is for the civilian council. You're exiling me because you believe that my disappearance will cause you to be safe when the Akatsuki comes for me. After all, if the target isn't here, why would they attack, is one of your reasoning that you use to sleep soundly. But that's not the underlying reason though, you fear change. When he said this, the others in the room looked at the elders and saw them go deathly white, but Naruto continued on regardless. I can see it in the eyes of each of you who called for my banishment or execution. Not only do you fear change, but you fear the very possibility of change. Very well, if you want me gone, then I'll leave. But I want my real name listed when you do so. Danzo and the elders looked like they were about to have cardiac arrests at that point. But Tsunade was grinning. She wanted vengeance for her surrogate son. Alright Naruto, for the record, what is your real name? Naruto returned the grin, and chuckled malevolently. My name is Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze, son of Minato Namikaze and Kushina Uzumaki, and I am only a shadow clone. His true name had frozen the entire proceedings. But the fact that he was a mere shadow clone caused a new uproar, understandably so, since it meant he could be anywhere, which was quickly silenced so that Tsunade could ask the question. What do you mean? You can't be one. I checked your life signs this morning and you were as alive as we are. Naruto smirked. The boss knew that some bull crap would happen like this, so he decided to leave before some idiots decide to send their subordinates after him. Here he glared at Danzo, who fidgeted in his seat. How did that brat know? However, before any more scrutiny could be added to him, the SC continued speaking. By now he could be anywhere from Iwa to the land of blades. Enjoy trying to hunt him down in the political shit storm you just walked into. With that final word the clone dispersed, leaving behind a maelstrom of chaos and confusion. Land of Blades. A river between Belka and Zeon. In the Land of Blades a certain blonde smirked as he got the memories from his shadow clone. He actually laughed at the dumb shit the council thought they could pull. He knew that he would eventually have to return one day. After all, Akatsuki wouldn't eliminate themselves, but as its savior, ally or its destroyer was entirely up to the future to decide. And how pissed off they made him through their actions between now and then, as well as how they acted when he returned. For now though, he had his mother's scroll to read, and with it find the hidden throne of the Golden Emperor, also known as the Mercenary General. It had come as a bit of a surprise when he found out that his ancestor on his mother's side united Land of Blades into the Empire of Blades, before he was betrayed by his generals. However, he first had to find the two swords of his ancestor. Excalibur, a bastard sword that seemed to be made of liquid silver because of how the light played off the blade, and Durandal, his ancestor's two-handed sword that was used while on horseback and against horsemen while on foot. Once that happened, none would be able to dispute his position as emperor, and his goal to reunite the lands and make them strong again like they once were would become a reality. In an underground facility, a bandaged mummy-like man was seething that he had lost the Kyuubi Jinchuriki to control. He had already sent out 10 squads of his best Rude Anbu to find the Jinchuriki to bring back for him to control and start his plan to rule the world. 2 years later, Principality of Idate, in the area around the village of Sekigahara. It had been a long and bloody 2 years, however during that time the land had become more unified. Now instead of the dozens of principalities fighting for supremacy, only 2 forces remained, and the land was divided between them. The northern lands, Idate Russia, China, and several smaller principalities that had been absorbed into those 3, were controlled by Ieyasu Tokugawa, named after the legendary unifier of Idate. The southern lands, Xi'an, Belka, Prussia, Latium, and numerous other smaller principalities that had been merged into those 3, were controlled by the self-proclaimed Emperor of Blades. Little was known about the man. The only concrete thing anyone knew was that he was a foreigner and wielded the 2 blades of the original emperor while claiming those blades to be his birthright. Tokugawa knew that if the claims of this upstart were true, then his forces would dissolve very quickly. Even in this day and age, many owed loyalty to the emperor and his family, so if he was fighting the one who could be the heir to the throne, then his forces would melt away like snow before the summer heat. However, for now it was not known if the man was who he claimed to be, so his army was ready to fight. Tokugawa decided to position his forces, a total of 300,000 men, on the hills and mountains surrounding the critical town of Sekigahara. The town in and of itself wasn't much, however, it straddled the main roadway between the north and south. As such, any army would have to pass through the town to attack. He also positioned the few field artillery pieces, some small ballistae and cannons, in the center of his forces, to ensure they could cover the main road. He positioned the majority of his elite samurai in the center as well, while the flanks were held by arasigaru, or foot soldiers. And on the extreme left and right of his army was his force of 40,000 horsemen. In all, Tokugawa felt confident that his forces could defeat the southern army of this Emperor of Blades. However, that confidence would soon be tested. An hour later, huge dust clouds filled the horizon, marking the progress of an impossibly large army as it moved north towards Sekigahara. At the head of the massive column of troops were men armed and armored in the exact same way the legions, full-plate armor modeled after old Gothic armor from the late Middle Ages, with tower shields that were made of layers of oak and iron, a short steel sword that could extend from 2 feet in length blade-wise to 3 feet, and 2 javelins. The emperor used to initially unify the land. Behind the legionaries came a massive group of pikemen, armed with an 18-foot-long spear with what amounted to a double-headed axe stuck beneath a spear tip as the main damage inflictor. They were clad in heavier and more protective versions of the legionaries' armor to make up for the lack of a shield. There were also columns of halberdiers, men in equally heavy armor armed with the same shield as the legionaries, and a 7-foot-long version of the pike that could be wielded one or two-handedly. They were the elite shock troops of the Southern Army. Most of the infantry units mentioned so far came from either Prussia or Latium, the old name for Roman-controlled territory. However, the ranged troops, kitted out in lesser armor than the other units, were from Belka, a land that maintained archery and every other form of ranged combat as their primary means of attack. Most of them were armed with 7-foot-tall longbows made of yew, but a small number were armed with flint-lock rifles, enabling them to act as snipers and officer killers. The bulk of the cavalry, all of them decked out in heavy armor and equipped with a lance and sword as well as a shield, was provided by Xi'an, which, much like the nation of France before the advent of chakra, served as the premier land of knights. And finally, rounding out the force was a massive artillery train, with weapons ranging from light cannons and small ballistae all the way up to giant city-smashing guns. The majority of the weapons were provided by the city-state of Nebulon, an independent city within Prussia renowned for their weapon-making expertise. But the real intimidation factor, besides the fact the southern lands were completely united and their best were in the field, was this fact. Tokugawa was outnumbered 4-1, by an army of 1,600,000 soldiers. It was the largest force assembled by one of the powers since the empire's dissolution over 100 years ago. The Imperials formed their line in an exact mirror of Tokugawa's, but the majority of the pikemen were hidden on the flanks where they would be able to easily destroy Tokugawa's heavy cavalry, allowing the northern army's lines to be rolled up by a pincer maneuver of knights. The battle opened when the Imperial artillery opened fire, pinning down the Tokugawa center and supporting a simultaneous infantry assault made of 50,000 legionaries. The legionaries quickly covered the half a mile without suffering any casualties, and as they got to within 50 yards of the Tokugawa lines, the supporting artillery fire stopped, to ensure that there would be no friendly fire casualties. When the fire stopped, the Tokugawa arose from their positions and charged the Imperials. But before the two lines could collide, the Imperial legionaries tossed their two javelins into the tightly packed Tokugawa lines, killing thousands. The legionaries then drew their short swords, and awaited the Tokugawa with their shields at the ready to block the downward strikes of their foes before countering with a stab to the gut or other vulnerable area. While the infantry fought it out in the center, on the flanks the Imperial Knights charged right at their northern counterparts. The horsemen fought for a while, before at some unknown signal the Imperial Knights withdrew back towards their own lines. This caused the Tokugawa cavalry, undisciplined despite their obvious skill, to pursue them, right into the waiting trap of Imperial pikemen. The Tokugawa didn't know what hit them. Soon enough the samurai were either all captured or dead. With the flanks now clear, nearly the entire Imperial army, over 1 million men and women, advanced in step. The Tokugawa, driven more by desperation than good sense by now, charged down to engage the Imperials in a bloody melee. The Imperial legionaries proved themselves superior to the samurai of Idate, and the numerous other units subordinated to them, due to their intense training and fighting method. For every legionary that fell, at least 2 samurai would fall under the blade of the dead soldier. The kill ratio was even more in favor of the Imperials when it came to units like the die-hard Legio X Equestris. But the legionaries were not the only ones to prove their superiority compared to the Tokugawa forces. The halberdier units sliced through Tokugawa's elite guard, most of which were either armed with no dachis or a katana wakazi combo, with ease. Once they reached Tokugawa himself, the halberds formed a ring around him where they waited until their leader would arrive to deal with Tokugawa. The longbowmen of Belka also played a key role in the bloody battle once it began in earnest, raining death upon the Tokugawa ranks with thousands upon thousands of arrows. Their efforts decimated many of Tokugawa's units that he was counting on to be able to hold the Imperials off until reinforcements could arrive in the form of his son's army as well as his loyal retainers that had gathered armies of their own to help. But the Knights of Zeon, and the other southern lands, were the most lethal part of the Imperial forces now that they didn't have to guard the flanks. They easily cut through the vulnerable flanks of the Tokugawa infantry, causing panic and massive casualties among the poorly trained peasant soldiers that formed the majority of Ieyasu's army, which routed the army. Ieyasu was 4 foot tall, slightly pudgy, clad in blue steel samurai armor, and armed with a spear that could shoot cannonballs. However, he was a foot taller in his armor because of his shogun helmet's giant peak-like point. And at this moment he sat calmly in the middle of the Imperial halberdiers. He knew that he was neither free nor a prisoner yet, so there must be a reason for this. And at that moment a 6'6" figure in a complex suit of armor that covered the wearer completely in plate armor. Look up Deathwatch's story. Naruto. Lord of the Phantom Court. Then recolor the cover image silver where it's black and gold where it's white, and that's the armor. And on the figure's back was the legendary sword Durandal, and at his side was Excalibur. Tokugawa spoke with a faint tone of annoyance. What do you want? Have you come to taunt me before finishing me off yourself? The emperor snorted. Are you that stupid, Tokugawa? You're more useful to me alive than dead. I have a proposition for you, but first let's head somewhere that doesn't affect our judgments, like the inn down in the village below us, for example. A half an hour later found the two rulers sitting at a private table talking about everything from philosophy to warfare. However, soon enough Ieyasu turned the conversation to why the two were talking in the first place. So what is this proposition that you were referring to? Here the emperor paused to consider how to word it to the prideful man in front of him. He finally decided to put it bluntly. The offer is this. You and your lineage shall swear allegiance to me and my lineage for as long as my family rules. In return, Idate shall belong to you and your descendants for as long as they live and are loyal to the throne. Tokugawa thought for a minute. So in return for my allegiance, and that of my family, Idate shall be mine for eternity. Here the emperor smiled benignly as he responded. You would answer to me, and my heirs, but yes, Idate would be yours. Tokugawa quickly agreed to the terms, especially after the emperor explained that this was a move to secure stability. Since the people might obey him, they would obey him all the more eagerly if they were directly ruled by a man or woman they respected. Konoha. A week after the battle. For the past 2 years things had gotten worse in Konoha. Mostly because all the alliances that Konoha had gained from missions that Naruto was on had all but been shredded by the other villages, countries, and towns they were from. The only one left even remotely intact was the one with Suna, but that was all but hanging on by a thread since Suna refused to help except during war times. Another thing that happened was that a year after Naruto had left, a huge scroll was found at the north gate of Konoha. When the Hokage had it opened, over 200 bodies with blank masks with word "Nay" on them fell out. The bodies were mutilated in the worst possible way, mostly by sword wounds, and the faces under the masks were missing their eyes, with the faces twisted in looks of horror. The eyes were in a bag that fell out of the scroll as well. When the civvies saw this, they all but threw up what they had for the past week. Other things that had happened is that in the past 2 years Jiraiya had been trying to get spies into the Land of Blades, but never had any luck. Nearly every time he tried, the spy would either never show up again or would come back stating they would not risk their lives in that land of chaos and death any longer. The last spy reported that the war was over, but that he would be unable to work there any longer because the Imperials had established an especially thorough and ruthless counter-espionage unit which was hunting down and eliminating spies and traitors with extreme prejudice, no matter the age, race or gender of the spy, traitor. Right now Tsunade was in the middle of a council meeting, seething at what the civvies were implying she did now, and was finally at the snapping point. The one to finally push her to her snapping point was a certain pink-haired thing. You can't exactly call her a banshee, a howler monkey, or any other insult, cause that is an insult to the insult. We, the council, demand that you send some shinobi to the Land of Blades, and discover who is in charge and force them into an alliance with us. Tsunade was so mad that people thought they saw a demonic version of her in a silhouette behind her, and it was grinning sadistically. It was honestly enough to scare them, but at the same time made them hate her more than they already did for her not letting them kill the Kyuubi brat or even have him put in the bingo book at all. Some of the council members agreed, while others scooted away from her knowing she was most likely about to die, and they were right too. As right after they were out of the way, a fist collided with the Haruno's forehead, surprisingly only knocking her out due to the super dense skull she had, and Tsunade barked, "Anbu! Get the civilians out of here and take the ones that sided with the Haruno, as well as the Haruno herself, and tell Ibiki and Anko to hold nothing back, and there are no rules, they can use anything and everything they want." The Shinobi Council, and for some reason the old geezers Kaharu and Homura, all visibly relaxed as the civilians were taken away. The only one that seemed upset was Danzo. This was understandable since they always agreed with him. "Now, I am taking control back from the civilians. They had too much power and should not have been allowed in ninja affairs. If you have a problem with this, there's the door." As she finished speaking, she pointed maliciously at the door. No one got up and left, letting the meeting continue as it should have. After going over the normal day-to-day things, Tsunade started massaging her temples. "As much as I hate to admit it, the civilians were right in one respect. We need a new ally. As it stands, the Land of Blades is the only one we have a chance securing one with. As such, we need a team to serve as an escort for Jiraiya, since he is going to be our negotiator, to the Land of Blades. If there are no objections, I have decided to send Anko, Yamato, as well as teams 7, 8, 9, and 10 along with their senseis as the escort. Hopefully, besides getting this alliance, we might be able to find Naruto and reinstate him, since the Fire Lord has rescinded the banishment because he knows that the accusations against Naruto were faked." Everyone nodded in acceptance, signalizing their lack of complaints, knowing that if they didn't get this alliance they were screwed 10 ways to Monday. Little did they know that it might already be too late. The Konoha shinobi finally were able to disembark from the ship they had taken passage on to get to the Empire. The boat they had chartered was very different in comparison to the junks and other small ships they were used to. This vessel was 204 feet long, 43 feet wide, and had 3 square-rigged masts, but it was also heavily armed with 44 cannons. It was only halfway to their destination that they discovered the original purpose of the ship. It was originally meant to be part of Belka's navy, but with the conquest of Belka by the Emperor, the ship became obsolete as a warship, and as such was converted into a merchant ship. As they left the ship, which had been renamed the Black Dream by the merchants who used it, they took in their surroundings, more specifically how similar the architecture of Edo was like that of their own land, However, there was a major difference in the fact that the city was dominated by a massive castle and numerous gun batteries to serve as shore defense positions. Another difference was that instead of shinobi patrolling the streets, what they saw were heavily armored soldiers working alongside lighter armed troops in a police role. However, the fact that they were not shinobi didn't make them any less effective, something the soldiers proved when they stopped a pickpocket who had stolen the wallets of the Konoha shinobi. After exploring the city for a while, they joined a caravan headed to the temporary capital of the empire, Paris, which was in the former Principality of Xi'an, now renamed France in remembrance of what was long before the empire was founded. The trip took several weeks, mostly due to the fact that the caravan took the long way so it would avoid all the pockets of anti-imperial sentiment, mostly clans and bandits whose way of life was threatened by imperial hegemony, that were being stamped out by the imperial armies. In fact, even though the caravan avoided most of the rebellious areas, they came across a group of poorly equipped rebels fighting against members of Legio X Equestris. The small battle was a massacre. The entire rebel force was annihilated with the Legio's detachment suffering no casualties. The main reason for this was the iron discipline of the unit, but there was also the presence of several primitive flint-lock rifles in the unit which eliminated the heaviest armored members of the rebel force with ease. The commander of the detachment, a man in black and silver armor with a European knight-style helmet on, spent a bit of time talking to the head merchant before leaving with the majority of the unit. However, 10 legionaries and 2 horsemen stayed with the caravan as an escort. When Jiraiya asked about why an escort was needed, he was told that since the Konoha shinobi were there as diplomats, it would be rude for the merchants to expect them to fight to defend the caravan. Paris, France, formerly Xi'an. 1 week later, the group of Konoha nin and the caravan had finally reached the temporary heart of the empire, France, or going by the old, recent name Xi'an. The city itself was extremely impressive. Its architecture was completely different than the elementals in that every building was designed so that even the small houses that the majority of the population lived in brought the attention of the inhabitants to the heavens. The city was divided in two by the Seine River, which ran down the middle of the city. An artificial island was in the center of the Seine, and on that island was a massive European-style castle. But the most impressive part was that there were 3 massive walls that protected the city and all but guaranteed that any siege would be long and bloody. The caravan had broken off at the first set of gates to the city, where a platoon of legionaries from Legio 501, aka the 501st, was ready to take the Konoha shinobi to the massive citadel palace where the emperor resided for the time being. Jiraiya, for several reasons not limited to the fact that he was the diplomatic representative for this mission and that the legionary in charge of the detachment was a woman, tried to start up a relatively friendly conversation. "So Soldier-san, when will the emperor be ready to see us?" The officer, easily identifiable by the gold trim on her armor and also obviously having been warned ahead of time of Jiraiya's perversions, responded in a terse tone. "The emperor will see you when he decides to see you. Right now he is with the war council planning the next moves to end the insurrections that have sprung up from the clans and bandits who had carved out their own pocket domains during the previous century of war." With that very point-blank answer, Jiraiya shut up. After he did so, it was a short trip to the imperial citadel, where lead to a waiting area with a secretary, an attractive blonde with C-cups who had obviously heard of Jiraiya, who had a look of disdain on her face at the sight of the Konoha shinobi. The secretary spoke in an extremely agitated voice when the Konoha group approached her desk. "What can I do for you?" Jiraiya, a little nervous from seeing how agitated the secretary was, spoke up. "We are here to see the emperor. When will we be able to?" The secretary checked the schedule and saw the meeting was almost over. This led her to decide to see if they were almost done. More to get them out of her hair than anything else, since she had the important task of sorting the emperor's paperwork before it reached him. However, when she opened the door, Sakura, Neji and Kiba brushed past her like they owned the place, and entered the war council room. Once they were in, several heads turned and glared at the intruders, who had smug looks on their faces. Jiraiya was shocked and horrified that those 3 would have the stupidity to do so, especially since what they just did could be considered an assassination attempt or espionage at best. "What the hell do you think you idiots are doing?" Neji, stick back up his ass from Naruto's banishment, spoke in his usual arrogant tone. "We saw the trash going in, so we thought we would go in and not have her bother with formalities and whatnot." The emperor was thoroughly enraged by Neji's attitude, as well as the Konoha nins breaking into the meeting. Guards, arrest the Konoha shinobi for trespassing on a war meeting. Several soldiers dressed in high-tech cycloptic because they had a single, red eye, that tracked movement. Armor armed with a double-headed halberd came out of the metal walls somehow like they were made from it and carried off the screaming Konoha nin. The emperor sighed as the Konoha nin's screams became fainter and fainter. I guess our meeting is done until I can deal with this matter. But first I think I will go see my lovely wives Koyuki and Kira for a while before getting back to work. A man dressed in a dark blood-red armor, with gold trim going along it. The gauntlets were in the shape of demonic claws. And his feet the same. He also had a cape with the kanji that said, "No blood no glory" on the back. And his helmet was the shape of a dragon's head with 6 twisted bone horns coming out of the headpiece. And attached to his back was what looked like a folded axe, but this was incorrect. It was what was known as a switch axe. It had the ability to switch from an axe to a sword with relative ease, but was very difficult to master said weapon. This man was known as Antonio de Angelo, or as his enemies knew him as the Demon of Blood, asked, in his normal half-crazed voice. Think an older Gaara still affected by the Ichibi, is he allowed to do that? The man that was sitting to the immediate right of Naruto was clad in a complex suit of armor the color of liquid silver, with 6 eye slits on the helmet which looked like the head of an angel with its halo. He also had a shield that looked like it was formed from a pair of angelic wings. He also had a bastard sword at his side that had 2 axe heads at the end of the crossguard. He was currently unhelmed so that his allies could see his face, which much like every member of the Prussian aristocracy was a lightly tanned Caucasian with piercing blue eyes and blonde hair with a face that just drew people in. His name was Michael Kushrinada, also known as Razgriz. The first of the 2 field marshals replied in his usual cavalier tone. He's the emperor, he can do whatever he wants. His comrade nodded before replying. Hey, remember when we had to put him in a room naked with Joan to basically show him everything having to do with repopulating the imperial family? I can still remember when he came out he had a big shit-eating grin on his face. Michael groaned at that. Yeah, still can't believe that worked. Your ideas never work but that one did for some reason. Inside the dungeons and torture chambers of Chateau de Lames, the Castle of Blades. Once the Konoha shinobi were brought to the dungeon they were quickly disarmed, their chakras sealed, and they were all put in separate cells. The thing that scared them the most besides how ruthlessly efficient the guards had been was how quickly it happened. It had taken less than 10 seconds for the whole process to occur. Kiba, the next into the interrogation chambers, fared worse than Jiraiya. He not only got kicked in the balls for being defiant but also got a temporary gender change due to an unbreakable seal being placed on him. Neji, arrogant ass that he was, got the tongue loosener as his torture. Basically what happened was that one of the torture experts, a man by the name of Hans, took a large plier and pulled Neji's tongue so far out that it looked like a giant piece of gum before letting it go. When it returned to Neji's mouth it was long enough that it was wrapped up to the point that his whole mouth was full. And the list went on, each shinobi or kunoichi being subjected to either hilarious but cruel and unusual punishments. For example, making Shino eat a pile of insects imported from the Abrum clan, to old-fashioned ones like the rack for Asuma. But perhaps the funniest, and at the same time most disturbing one, had been when the Imperial Inquisitors dispelled the genjutsu around Sasuke, only to discover that the last Uchiha wasn't a dude, in front of Sakura and Ino. This brought a halt to the proceedings so the Emperor could learn the truth. Emperor's Chambers. Naruto chuckled slightly as he spoke. Well, I can honestly say I am staying here until morning. Those the idiots from Konoha can wait till then. This was the right and wrong thing to say apparently, as the former daimyo of Spring made perfectly clear. Naruto-kun. Just have them all killed and keep fucking us until me and Kira-chan are both pregnant as Joan. Kira growled slightly when she spoke up in support of her sister's idea. Yeah, Naruto-kun, I want us to have a big family with lots of little kids running around. Besides, it's not fair you let Joan have first dibs. But before any of the fun could begin, a knock came to the door of the chambers. A slightly nervous but still understandable voice broke through the air. My lord, we have found something very interesting. I think you should come down to the torture chambers and see this. Naruto sighed and got up with both lovely ladies groaning in displeasure as their fun time was interrupted by work, yet again, and at this rate neither would be truly satisfied until the Konoha nins were gone or killed. The latter being the best choice in both their minds, but they knew their husband would never do that. When Naruto left the bedroom and went to the door, after getting dressed in his armor, he opened it with the Akari Death Glare standing version trained on the lowly grunt who interrupted his happy time. The soldier shrinked back thinking he was about to die, before Naruto said, "This better be good, you know I don't like being interrupted when it comes to alone time with my wives." The soldier nodded before telling him that he was just the messenger, and that the head of T&I, Tier, sent him to get the emperor since she was still busy torturing the Konoha nins, especially Asuma who kept hitting on her. Which also made Kurenai pissed off, since she thought he loved her and was about to give him her virginity, but not now or ever. So with that report, Naruto made his way to the torture chamber, while smoking a cigar, and when he got there all the soldiers gave bows. Tier walked up to the emperor giving him a sisterly hug, and then walking up to Antonio de Angelo, who decided to tag along for a little bit as well as to see if he could get into the torturing along with one of his girlfriends, and kissing him, before going back to the emperor and getting on one knee before saying, "Sire, we found out that the Uchiha heir is actually a female. Her name is Satsuki Uchiha." Naruto chuckled slightly to himself as he walked to his personal interrogation chamber. As he did so his cape billowed behind him, and called over his shoulder, Interesting. Take her to the personal interrogation chamber for me. I would like to have some words with her." Tier yelled her instructions to her subordinates. "Okay, you heard him, take the Uchiha to the chamber." After she was satisfied that her subordinates were carrying out her instructions before she went back to Antonio and had a conversation. Tier spoke in a slightly husky, but mostly teasing tone. "So when I come home you can give me a massage with those masterful hands of yours, and then I will give you something very special, okay?" Antonio gained a nearly unnoticeable nosebleed as he responded, "I would like nothing better than to rock your world. Like the first time, and the second, and the time after that, and so on and so forth. So how about you come home now and we can start?" The head of T&I giggled as she lightly punched him on the arm. "Silly, I can't come home until we lock all the prisoners back up." That caused Antonio to gain a depressed look as he responded, "Sigh, fine, I will see you at home." As he started walking past her, he slapped her on the ass, making her mule before she went back to work, with very dirty thoughts in her head. The emperor's personal interrogation chamber. Satsuki sat in the chair with chakra restraining cuffs on her hands as well as legs, waiting for her interrogator to come so she could get this over with. She was mortified that someone had dispelled something that was supposed to be impossible to unless she did so herself. Just as she started going over her 10th contingency plan, she finally heard the click of a door being opened, and when she opened her eyes she was surprised to see the man they came to talk to sitting in front of her. The emperor took a cigar out of his helmet before tossing it in the trash bin. He then began to speak in the highly intimidating and authoritative tone she had heard before, however it sounded a bit more relaxed right now. "So, Satsuki, is it? I would like to know why you hid your gender while in Konoha for so long." Satsuki contemplated lying, but quickly decided that would be bad, before she answered, "Because if I didn't, I would have been nothing but a breeding factory for those assholes on the council." The emperor was silent for a few seconds, as if having an eternal debate, before he spoke again, but this time cautiously. "What would you say if I let you live in the empire? You won't be forced into anything and you can stay yourself." The last female Uchiha snorted derisively before responding, "I would say you were bluffing. Everyone wants the Sharingan in their ranks." At this the armored figure laughed. "I wouldn't allow it. Mostly because you were once a comrade and a brother. Well, I thought of you as a brother, but now I can't since you're female." That shocked Satsuki, who barely managed to stop herself from stuttering. "What do you mean? Who are you?" Naruto stared for what seemed like hours before unclasping the helmet on his head and slowly taking it off his head before putting it down on the table, and then that's when Satsuki gasped. "Naruto, but how? I am the emperor. I became the sole ruler of the southern lands a year after I was banished. I then united the rest of the land under the imperial banner through blood, sweat, death and tears." Satsuki, although she trusted Naruto more than most, knew that he had to do what was best for his empire, so she needed to make sure she wouldn't be forced into anything. "How can you guarantee your council won't force me into anything?" Naruto would have laughed, except he remembered how much power the civilians had in Konoha, as much he decided to stop beating around the bushes. Because this is a dictatorship with advisement, I make the rules, and when necessary listen to advice. But if they were to try anything, it's off to the chopping block. So what do you say? Do you wish to live under the aegis of the empire? It was a tough decision. As such, it took Satsuki a while to weigh every option before answering. Konoha's diplomatic effort goes wrong thanks to the arrogance of certain members of Jiraiya's bodyguard unit. Because of their actions, the Konoha shinobi were sent to the dungeons to be interrogated. During the interrogation, Sasuke was revealed to be a girl, unsurprisingly named Satsuki Uchiha. Naruto, aka the Emperor, gave her an offer to live in Blades. The cells the Konoha nin are being held in, now. Jiraiya and the other Konoha ninjas were very nervous by this point. Satsuki had been gone a very long time. They were about to ask the guards what had happened to her, when the dungeon doors opened and footsteps could be heard. They then saw Satsuki in chains and being chained back up in a very peculiar-looking cell. The reason it was peculiar was because it had the words "at dawn" on it. Jiraiya decided to voice the question on everyone's minds. Why are you being chained up more than us, and why did the Emperor wish to talk to you? To their surprise, Satsuki looked up from the floor with tears in her eyes and in an almost broken voice replied, I have been sentenced to death by the Emperor, and the sentence is to be carried out at dawn. With this revelation, the others were shocked and outraged and were about to start saying the Emperor couldn't do that, until they were all shocked into blissful unconsciousness by the seals burning on their chains. As soon as she was sure they were unconscious, Satsuki smiled, remembering what had happened and how she would eventually be freed of her duty to Konoha. The Emperor's personal interrogation chamber, half an hour earlier. Satsuki's face lit up with a smile as she finished her sentence. Accept your terms, Emperor Dono. Naruto smiled as well at that, and started chuckling. That's extremely good news, Satsuki. As for how we'll convince Konoha to leave you alone, we'll stage a spectacle where you will be killed. Don't worry, you won't be up on the scaffold. It will be a clone that R&D will create from a sample of your DNA so that Konoha will have no reason to suspect your defection and have a body to take home. As for what happens afterwards, that's your choice. However, there are a couple options available to you off the top of my head. The first one is that you can join a part of the military. The Empire lacks trained chakra users, so if you want to join you could become an instructor or a unit leader. The second option is that you become a civilian, own a shop and raise a family or whatever you want. The final one is that you become one of my concubines. The last one was said so fast that Satsuki barely heard it. Wait, what did you just say? Naruto paused to take a breath and steady his nerves, before repeating himself. I said you could become one of my concubines, wives if you want. To the Uchiha era's credit, she didn't blink at the last option, but on the inside she had come up with a good prank to play on Naruto as retribution for his past pranks. Maybe. With that, Satsuki walked up to Joan, who had just come into the chamber, and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. Is he good in bed? Joan, even though her husband was sputtering and blushing at Satsuki's question, gave a perverted giggle and smile as she replied. You will have the ride of your life with him, plus it's very addicting. Dawn the next day. The Konoha nins were gathered in one part of the courtyard early in the morning, and they were forced to face the scaffold the Imperials had constructed overnight. While they still did not know why Satsuki was to be executed, they had a feeling that they were about to find out. Something that was reinforced by the appearance of one of the inquisitors dressed in black robes, and the executioner, also dressed in black, but he was armed with a massive two-handed sword with a flat tip. The inquisitor then unrolled a scroll and began to read aloud. On this day, December 1st of the year 1506 after Sage, we are gathered for the execution of one of the last Uchiha, Satsuki Uchiha. As he paused to gather his thoughts, a light dusting of snow began to fall. The Uchiha has committed no crime herself, however it is the crimes of her ancestors and allies that she is to be executed. Her great-grandfather, Madara Uchiha, killed several lords in the original emperor's court, resulting in the rebellion of the generals. Her great-great-great-grandfather, Kazama Uchiha, killed the current emperor's great-great-great-grandfather and raped his great-great-great-grandmother. The crimes of the two long-dead Uchiha caused the group of Konoha ninjas to become slightly sick. However, the Inquisitor wasn't done yet. But it is the crimes of her allies that far outweigh those of her ancestors. Infiltrating our great nation, Spying on our military base at Sekigahara, they passed through the area for the night and did take note of it on their way to the capital. But most importantly, insulting the emperor and his court through their foolishness. Because of these crimes, and the fact that the other members of the diplomatic group are too important to Konoha to execute, she is sentenced to be beheaded at dawn by the executioner's blade, the same one used since time immemorable by Xi'an and France to execute nobles who betray their country. Bring out the criminal. The gates to the dungeons opened and a squad of legionaries led Satsuki, who was dressed in simple white clothes, to the scaffold. She then put her neck on the cutting block as the executioner raised his blade above his head, before bringing it down. That single stroke severed Satsuki's head from her shoulders, causing it to fall into a bag. The gates of the chateau. That afternoon, the group of Konoha ninja were gathered at the gates, with their chakra-suppressing seals, that would only dissolve once they were out of the Empire's territory and would actually reappear if they were to ever come back to the Land of Blades when there was at least a general or above in the area that also had a beacon that would activate, informing the Emperor and his generals if anyone with said seal re-entered the area, with the stern visages of the 32 Legio 10 members assigned to be their escorts glaring at them with barely contained rage. In Jiraiya's hands was a sack, which carried the Satsuki clone's body. The head was going to be kept by the Emperor as a sort of trophy, supposedly at least, which was barbaric in the minds of the Konoha group, even after the commander of the detachment of legionaries explained that it was accustomed to do that to the heads of spies or traitors to warn against treachery. Naruto walked up to the gate's entrance and looked at the ninja with a stern glare, one that seemed to make the area around the Konoha nins turn to ice with how cold his eyes were. Without letting up on his glare, he spoke in a frigid tone. Leave here and never return, unless you are invited. For if you do, I will personally make your time in the dungeons seem like paradise compared to the torture I will put you through. Also tell that asshole Danzo that if any more rude come to my empire, Konoha will be severely punished. The level of severity will vary depending on the amount he sends, with even one resulting in a blockade of all of Fire Country's ports. While he was saying this, Naruto's eyes turned red and looked as if a fire was behind them. This was actually a minor genjutsu that Kyuubi had taught him to do with her chakra. With that, Naruto handed a scroll to Antonio de Angelo, who in turn took it and walked over to his brother-in-arms Michael. The armored Prussian nodded before leading the Konoha group out of the gates, with the legionary detachment following closely behind. 3 hours later, the group was passing through Below Woods, a small forest halfway between Paris and one of the new imperial military transport hubs. Michael, who was leading the group, had his left hand casually resting on the hilt of his hand and a half-sword. Same exact weapon as the bastard sword, it can be used one or two-handed, while his eyes surveyed the area, alert to any hidden danger. 5 minutes later, Antonio, whose danger senses, as he liked to call his sixth sense about ambushes, casually, for him at least, grabbed the shaft of his switch axe and prepared for the attack he felt was coming. And exactly as he thought, a rain of shuriken and kunai fell from the trees that the group was passing below. The barrage was not aimed at any of the Konoha residents, however that did not mean that there were no casualties. Several legionaries fell when the kunais pierced their necks before the group could form a testudo to block out the rain of kunais. However, the two field marshals' armor was too thick to be cut by such pathetic weapons, and as such they waited for the storm of projectiles to die down. When the rain did stop, they saw several squads of root anbu drop from the trees with their ninjatus out. Michael looked at the root anbu and told Antonio to let him have these guys. His blood demanded retribution for the deaths of his men. Antonio quickly nodded. Michael's wrath was near legendary when it was enkindled, and those foolish root had managed to anger him, and went and leaned against a tree, at which time he promptly took out a scroll and started to study some new weapon stances for his switch axe. Michael slowly drew his sword, causing the unmistakable sound of one of Prussia's war blades being drawn to fill the air. You fools made a big mistake coming here. The aristocrat disappeared in a blink of an eye, shocking those who did not know he could move that fast, and when he reappeared he slowly sheathed his blade. And when the blade clicked to signify it had been sheathed, the entire root anbu unit, all 20 of them, lost their heads, literally, causing small fountains of blood to shoot up into the sky. The blonde scoffed. If it weren't for the fact that I was avenging my dead soldiers, I would be insulted by how easy you fools died. As it stands though, you still weren't worth the time I put into killing you. The Konoha nin shivered in fear when they heard that, especially since he spoke with no arrogance or any other emotion except for boredom. They realized from that the angelic armored figure would not have fought and killed those rude operatives except for the fact that they killed 2 of the legionaries in the group. After they arrived at the transport hub, it took nearly a week to get to the port, even with using the Imperial military transports. Where the Konoha nin were shoved onto the ship, a much larger black-hulled Imperial ironclad, that would take them home, and as they were boarding, Jiraiya was given the scroll for Tsunade. After they arrived aboard their transport, it took a full week to get to the port in Fire Country, and then it took 2 days to get back to Konoha to give the scroll, news, as well as the body of Satsuki to the Hokage. 2 days later, note this is after they arrived back in Konoha council chambers. The councils were in an uproar after hearing the report the group leaders gave them about what happened in the Empire of Blades. Not only was their request for an alliance completely rejected, but the sole chance that Konoha had for getting the Uchiha clan repopulated was executed due to the foolishness of several of their ninjas. The civilians were calling for either an invasion of Blades or for the expulsion of the shinobi responsible for the breach in decorum that resulted in the death of the last Uchiha. The elders were split between supporting the civilians or supporting the shinobi council's view that it was just an unfortunate misunderstanding, and that no action should be taken, least of all an invasion of the powerful empire. Into the middle of this embarrassing political shitstorm came the daimyo's decision to, once again, back the wishes of the civilian council, and order the shinobi of Konoha to join up with the Land of Fire's feudal army at the main ports for embarkation. Tsunade and the other members of the shinobi corps knew that this was the biggest mistake that the Land of Fire had committed since they banished the still missing Naruto. As such, Tsunade sent only the same group that went on the diplomatic mission, along with the entirety of the Root organization including Danzo himself, in the first wave. Now normally Danzo would believe this to be an attempt to eliminate him and his entire organization. But his mind was filled with visions of a greater Fire Country, and by extension Konoha. One that was unchallengeable and capable of launching a war of conquest against the entire world. However, none of the observers in the elementals could have predicted the true outcome of this invasion. Many would believe that the fire forces would have the advantage since they were all from one nation and the empire was made of numerous little feudal alignments that would probably look to their own concerns before those of the imperial throne. However, those very same analysts in the fire court underestimated the charisma and strength within the new emperor, something that enabled him to bind together traditional enemies into an empire the likes of which had not been seen since roughly 100 years ago. On top of that, they underestimated the strength of the imperial soldier, a battle-hardened veteran of at the least 1 full year of total war and at the most 30 years of non-stop violence and aggression, and their commanders, specialists who could inspire superhuman feats within their subordinates and match the Sannin in one-on-one fights. But the thing that they couldn't have even estimated the power of, even if they knew of it, was the prototype Gatling guns and other gunpowder weapons that the Empire was beginning to mass produce, along with their small fleet of ironclad ships of the line. If you want to know what a ship of the line is, go to this page, but be sure to type it in with no spaces n. Wikipedia Wiki, ship _of _ the line, which were far superior to the wooden-hulled junks and kobayashi the feudal navies used. Nor were they aware of imperial intelligences, a branch of the Inquisition, massive net of spies and agents, even ones controlled by seals, that covered every nation and alerted the empire to the Land of Fire's intents. 1 week later, the northeastern shore of Idate, dawn. The early morning mist rolled back just as the last Imperial's initial response force, 110,000 men led by the 2 field marshals, got into position. And when it fully lifted, the entirety of the Land of Fire's invasion force was revealed. Over 10,000 of ship, mostly transport vessels, were situated just off the shore, and when they noticed that the fog had lifted, they started unloading rowboats filled to the brim with troops, and shinobi began walking towards the shore in support of the feudal forces. The feudal forces, made up of samurai Arishigaru warrior monks, priestesses and non-chakra using ninjas, real-life ninjas, that the daimyo of Fire Country had gathered, numbered at roughly 500,000. The Root organization numbered at 10,000 strong, not including their leader Danzo, recruited from around the elemental nations. And of course, at the heart of the formation was the members of Konoha's failed diplomatic mission. As soon as the first wave of transports, 10,000 men and women, and Root, 3,000 of them, hit the shore, the hidden Imperial weapons opened fire, tearing great bloody chunks out of the startled and panicking elementals. The Root, however, quickly realized where the hail of bullets and arrows was coming from and charged the emplacements, only to run into the concealed Imperial troops in their hidden trenches and forced into a bloody close-quarter fight. Meanwhile, more and more fire troops were being funneled into the meat grinder, and forced to cluster together in the few areas where cover had been purposefully left in place. After an hour of bloody fighting in the trenches, the first group of Root Anbu had been completely annihilated, and the constant barrage of gunfire and arrows, which had claimed the lives of 9,000 of the first wave, began to cease as the teams ran out of ammo or relocated. The Imperials had suffered 1,000 casualties stopping that first wave. It was then that the second wave of fire troops landed, 25,000 strong, supported by another 1,000 Root shinobis, and advanced on the entrenched Imperial infantry. As they advanced, though, they fell under fire from the legionaries as they tossed their javelins at the approaching invaders, causing moderate casualties amongst them. However, when the invaders arrived at the Imperial defense position, they were easily repelled after an hour, mostly due to the fact that the javelin barrage virtually destroyed the common soldiers, Arishigaras. Moral. However, it was the bloody melee which decimated their ranks, which drove home the fact that they were no longer in one of the Mei war games they fought. This was a real battle. Soon enough, the few surviving members of the second wave found themselves huddled behind the few pieces of cover that the first wave's survivors were hiding behind. Out of the force that launched in the wave, only 2,000 troops survived. Seeing that the survivors were pinned down, the third wave, containing every remaining feudal warrior, the remaining Root operatives, as well as Danzo himself and the Konoha Nins who were part of the failed diplomatic attempt, was launched in a do or die to take the beach and establish a breakthrough. However, it was at this point that the Empire played its deadliest forces. From inland came the thunderous song of heavy artillery being fired into the fire fleet, sinking dozens of ships every salvo. And from the sea came the Imperial Navy, firing every single gun they had into the invading fleet. As such, the invading Fire Country forces sped up their assault to try and prevent them from losing too many troops. Unfortunately, the cold fact was that even if they got every single warrior off of the fleet and onto the beach, they would have no means of retreat, and would be pinned in the few areas where there was some form of cover from the ruthless gunners who constantly strafed the area with fire, killing all who were out in the open. It was at this point that the survivors started to wonder why exactly these positions were protected from the Imperials' firepower. However, their answers soon came in the form of several of the positions detonating due to buried explosives, wiping out every soldier by the immediate area of the cover, and leaving the survivors vulnerable once again to the concealed gunners. However, after roughly 6 hours of this, only a few places remained safe for the fire troops to hide at. So far, roughly 75% of their entire force had been annihilated. Fortunately for them, however, there was still a good number of Root Anbu in the fight, as well as Danzo and the other Konoha Nins. Fortunately for the invaders, it was at this point that the Imperials ceased fire and stopped detonating the areas the fire forces were hiding behind, and the Imperials marched out of their trenches to crush or capture the remaining invading forces. However, the survivors of the invasion had a great rage that had built up in them over the day due to the callous annihilation of their friends and allies, and the sight of the Imperial infantry caused their anger to explode. As such, they charged out to meet them in battle. They would win or they would die, but they refused to be taken prisoner if they could avoid it. And with the ruthlessness that the legionaries were showing, there was no doubt in the minds of many of the invaders that even if they did win, it would be at an unacceptably high price. As such, the Konoha shinobi started using whatever ranged jutsu they had at their disposal, only to watch in horror as their attacks dissipated against the shields the legionaries carried. However, they didn't have long to think about it as the two armies clashed. The Imperials fighting in the same disciplined style, never exposing themselves to more danger than was necessary and striking with deadly precision. On the other hand, the survivors of this soon-to-be-termed massacre fought with ferocity and a certain air of recklessness about them, signifying their desire to take down as many Imperials as they could before they were all slain. However, unknown to all but the Imperials, the way that the fight was going was dividing the invaders into smaller groups that could be picked off at will. The two most important groups that had been isolated were the Konoha Nins loyal to the Hokage, along with a small group of Fire Country samurai, and the majority of the Root Anbu, who had been cut off from Danzo. It was at this point that Michael and Antonio de Angelo revealed themselves. with Michael going after the Hokage loyalists and Antonio charging the root agents. While Michael was slowly walking towards his targets, he was casually slicing any enemy that was foolish enough to try and slow his progress with his bastard sword, even bisecting some enemies. Meanwhile, Antonio had charged the cluster of root, his blood demanding retribution for the invasion in the form of the deaths of the root agents. With Antonio, after cutting through several dozen root with ease, Antonio found himself facing off against two 8 feet tall two-handed axe-wielding root operatives clad in heavy chakra armor, who even with their stunted emotions seemed to be glaring bloody murder at the switch axe wielder. Antonio grinned at them and charged, thinking they would be easy to defeat, only to get thrown back by a punch from one of the two, who were more than likely twin brothers. As soon as the marshal landed on his feet, his two foes charged him and started to attack in a synchronized pattern which left no time for counterattacks. As such, Antonio was obviously having a hard time, so he decided to take his axe and press the button on it, which caused it to switch from axe mode to sword mode. The sight of such a rare weapon caused the two root to temporarily stop their attack, which might give Angelo just enough time to begin to attack. Antonio made good use of their shock, breaking one of the axes and mortally wounding its wielder with a slash that wrecked the armor that the first giant wore and opened the man's chest completely, spilling his internal organs to spill out onto the blood-soaked sand. This obviously enraged the second root, who attacked with a vengeance, but was being just barely held off. Even though he was just barely holding the enraged giant back, Antonio was well aware of the weakness of his weapon. You see, a switch axe has one major flaw. It can only stay in sword mode for a short period of time, and during its transformation back to axe mode it's extremely fragile. Unluckily, when the transformation process began, the root swung with all his might and shattered the weapon into a million pieces. Antonio stared at his broken weapon that was a gift to him from his friend and brother-in-arms Michael. With a hate-filled cry, kicked one of the fallen weapons from the ground, which just so happened to be a halberd from one of the ill-fated attempts to break the root forces without having to involve the marshals by a group of halberdiers, and it flew through the air and landed in his hands. Surprisingly enough, it was a perfect fit, and he grinned maliciously before using the double-headed axe part to break his opponent's axe. He then followed it up with impaling the giant on the spearhead before continuing on his slaughter of the root forces. With Michael, when Michael heard the cry, he could only imagine the poor bastard's fates that pissed off his fellow field marshal before he went back to slicing and occasionally using his feet to kick someone out of his way. As he approached the Konoha contingent, they felt their chakra being forcibly sealed away, like during their time in the dungeons. As if to confirm their suspicions that the seals had reactivated, they felt a burning sensation from where the seals had been. At this point they realized that they were helpless. Michael, however, stopped a short distance from them and spoke in a carefree tone. "Nice day for a battle, isn't it?" The shinobi tensed at that but didn't respond, nor did any of the other people in the small knot of fire forces. Seeing this, Michael spoke up again. "I believe that you have noticed that your chakra has been sealed away again. As such, you know that there is no hope you could defeat me. I will give you one chance and one chance only. Surrender and you will be treated in a manner befitting people of your station. If you refuse, well, I don't have to explain it now, die?" With Michael's ultimatum made, his former foes surrendered. One samurai resisted, and was promptly knocked out by Michael. However, the samurai's helm came off due to the force of the blow, revealing an attractive young woman who Michael recognized as the Fire Daimyo's daughter. It was at this point that the main imperial army, numbering over 2 million strong and led by Naruto in his persona of the Emperor, arrived on the scene. Obviously, the mere sight of such a large force was enough to force the majority of the surviving fire troops, numbering roughly 50,000 by now, to surrender. However, there were still a few who refused to surrender, most notably Danzo. The geriatric, and slightly senile, Nin already had his implanted Sharingans and Mokuton arm out, and quickly went through the hand signs to summon the boss Baku to hopefully help annihilate the Empire's massive army. Naruto himself moved to engage Danzo, while Michael charged the Baku with rage in his heart, because that monster had taken part in Madara's attack and had slain many of his ancestors. Oh yes, this payback was going to be so fulfilling. With Michael as he fights the Baku, the elephantine chimera started off by trying to suck the marshal up, but all it succeeded in doing was devouring the corpses of the dead. Kushinada used his superior speed to quickly run up the trunk of the beast when it tried to swat him before slashing its face several times and then retreating out of reach of the monster's retaliation. The boss then tried to ram the angelically armored warrior with its horns, only for the swordsman to dodge at the last second and respond by cutting a deep gash into the much large monster's side. This caused the Baku to become enraged, and it jumped up into the sky with the intent to suck up everything on the battlefield. However, the swordsman watched unconcerned, and he soon revealed why he was so unconcerned when he split his shield in half before attaching the supposedly broken shield to his back. As soon as the two wing-shaped halves attached themselves to his back, they flexed and propelled him into the sky. Yeah. I took the Alto Angelo from DMC-4 for Michael's armor, deal with it. As the now airborne marshal got closer together, the elephantine monstrosity abandoned its plan to suck him in, and started trying to blow him down to the ground and kill him. However, every gust of air that he fired was dodged as the marshal readied his sword for the killing blow. As the two met, the blade shone brightly in the light before flashing as in scored the killing blow on the summon, sending its soul screaming into the abyss and sending its ruined form back to its former people. With Naruto facing off against Danzo, Naruto was extremely pissed off at the audacity that the Fire Country forces displayed, so instead of using only one of his two blades, he stunned everyone by using both in a deadly of death that Danzo was being hard-pressed to avoid. Soon enough, Naruto sliced off Danzo's Mokuton arm, and as Naruto mortally wounded him, Danzo revealed his trump card. Said trump card was a seal that would take out everyone and everything in a 50-mile radius, and as he died it started to become a huge black hole that if it wasn't stopped would engulf not only the Imperial forces, but the surviving land of fire forces as well. Naruto acted quickly. He sped through 500 hand seals so fast his hands actually became an after-image. And when his hands landed on the dragon hand seal, a huge portal surrounded the black hole that was forming. As soon as it fully encased the black hole, it swallowed it up and disappeared into another dimension, destroying any chance it had at killing the Emperor, his forces, and their prisoners. With the invasion defeated, the Imperials shipped the prisoners they had captured back to the incomplete true capital that was being constructed on the borders of France. England again switched Belka and Zion back to real-world names, Prussia and Latium. And as soon as the prisoners had been sent on their way along with their escorts, the Imperial fleet pulled in close to shore to embark the invasion force that was being launched against the fools who dared to attack the Empire. Ember Bay was a popular vacation spot for the Land of Fire's nobility, and as such usually had thousands of people there, mostly guards and servants that catered to the puffed-up nobles. Fortunately, or unfortunately depending on who you ask, the area was deserted, as it was coming up on winter. As such, there was no one there to see the tens of thousands of ships-strong Imperial fleet, which carried just slightly over 4 million soldiers and marines. There were already 2 million aboard the warships to serve as a second attack if miraculously the fire forces had held off the first group of 2 million, and they were added to the counterattack when they were no longer needed to attack the invaders, silently glide into the bay out of the morning mist. Soon enough those warships commenced landing operations, using specially designed landing craft that could carry up to 400 fully equipped soldiers or 4 artillery pieces along with their support, a process that would take several hours. The first to be disembarked were the members of Legios I, II, and X along with 20 batteries of field artillery and 2 cavalry, mostly heavily armored knights, regiments, who then proceeded to form a rough defensive formation while the rest of the invasion force disembarked. Meanwhile, Naruto was going over the battle plan with the field marshals and generals in charge of the individual elements of the invasion. Overall, the plan was for a multi-pronged assault with multiple targets. Antonio, supported by Guan Ping, Sun Wukong and Genji, would lead the assault on Konoha with 1 million troops in his formation. The next 2 pincers, the first being led by Sir John Fastolf and Sir John Talbot while the other was led by Lahire and Giles de Rais, would each have 500,000 men. Fastolf and Talbot's, and their subordinates, objective was to control the main road to River Grass and Rain. Lahire and de Rais would be sent to take control the main town on the road to Taki Hot Spring and Rice. Edward the Black Prince, supported by Lord John Chandos and his personal retainers, Henry Percy, Amaral the Assassin, and Branwen of the Bow, leading 1 million men, would be positioned centrally to support any of the other prongs if necessary. The final pincer was led by Naruto himself, with Michael Bertrand du Guesclin and Joan of Arc as his direct subordinates, were aimed at the capital of fire, Volcano City. There would be just over 1 million soldiers in the final prong. It wasn't a flawless plan, but it took advantage of the fact that the Empire outnumbered their foe at least 10 to 1, and that any reinforcements from allied countries had to take the main roads to get into the country with any appreciable numbers. As such, Naruto ordered that as soon as the forces were done unloading that they would commence their plan. After the disembarkation finished, the pincers split up and started their march to their assigned targets. Along the way they captured numerous small villages and their police, including several small contingents of samurai. However, one samurai escaped on a horse and sped off towards the capital, 20 miles away from his conquered village. Volcano City, 3 hours later. As per its name, the capital of the Land of Fire had been built at the foot of a long-dead volcano, and had some of the most fertile land in the country as its region. This large city had a 40-foot high and 20 feet wide wall surrounding the entirety of the area, roughly 30 miles around in a circle, and a secondary wall 60 feet high and 30 wide surrounding the older portions of the city. Both walls were made of bricks with obsidian covering the entirety of the walls. Inside the walls, the city was pretty much a larger version of Konoha, only without the shinobi-specific facilities. The inhabitants of this city of 3 million were going about their daily business, unaware of the failure of their military to invade the Empire of Blades. However, their calm was about to be broken. A tired-looking samurai, riding an equally tired horse, sped through the city towards the city shouting the news. The Imperials are coming. Obviously, this declaration was met with disbelief at first. The Land of Fire was the most powerful of the 5 nations. There was no way some newly founded empire could stand against them. However, soon enough the sight of samurai and other feudal troops rushing towards the walls of the city was enough to cause doubt and panic to spread, and the various classes of society reacted differently. The poor and the truly panicked middle class started looting stores and rioting, drawing forces away from the defense of the city to put down their minor rebellion. A good portion of the middle class grabbed whatever weapons they could get their hands on and formed themselves into a militia to defend their loved ones. For the most part, though, the rich and middle class hunkered down in their homes, and prayed that this was all just a false alarm and that the Empire of Blades was not truly invading. However, those prayers went unanswered, and the thunderous song of 1,000,000 marching soldiers proved that an hour later. As the various soldiers and paramilitary units in the city readied themselves for the assault that was to come, they watched in horror as scores of artillery batteries, mostly large-caliber siege cannons, were set up while the Imperial soldiers got into formation for their assault. However, much to their surprise, a single knight rode forward with a white flag on his lance. He then shouted, "I bring word from my lord, the Emperor of Blades. He demands the unconditional surrender of the entirety of the Land of Fire. If that demand is not met, then the civilians who wish to leave the city have 1 hour to do so before the artillery opens fire." And with his piece set, he started to ride back to the Imperial lines, before a literal storm of arrows rained down on him, sending both horse and rider to the ground looking like nothing more than a badly bleeding pincushion. Of course, this enraged the Imperials, none more so than Bertrand, who had convinced the Emperor to have that time period for evacuation, and the Imperials' answer to the arrow volley came when Michael, with the Emperor's blessing, ordered the artillery. Picture a bigger and more ornate version of this. www. Falling Pixel Napoleonic Siege Cannon 3D, Model, 1099 no spaces, to start battering down the walls of the city. To put the noise that filled the air into perspective, there were roughly 500 large-caliber siege guns firing away at the walls, so it was about as noisy as being in the heart of 1,000 tornadoes while thunder and lightning continuously made their presence known. For a half an hour the artillery fired a continuous barrage at the outer walls, and in half an hour one of the strongest walls in the world completely collapsed, allowing the Imperials to storm past the outer walls. Sure, the daimyo's subjects fought back against the invading Imperials, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. There were only 20,000 regular soldiers, samurai and Arashigaru. Most of the remaining army had been spread out to maintain law and order in the areas they drew troops from to attack the Empire, in the capital at the time. And only 16,000 civilians took up arms to defend their loved ones. So all told, there were only 36,000 combatants to fight against the Imperial invasion. As such, the first wave of Imperials, made almost entirely of the heavily armored halberdiers, easily destroyed all opposition in their path as they swept towards the inner wall of the city. Any civilians who tried to stop them were swiftly forced aside and became prisoners. However, when they reached the inner walls, thousands of arrows fired out of concealed positions, killing hundreds of them before they withdrew back out of range of the arrows. And then the daimyo, if there ever was a poster boy for being short useless bastard who you would likely forget as soon as you lost sight of him, this would be the guy, himself appeared on the wall. And unsurprisingly he started monologuing. To save you the time, the main thrust of this gloating was that the Imperials underestimated the capital's defenses and that the Empire had very high-ranked traitors in their country who handed the designs of the arrow turrets to the daimyo to humiliate the Imperials. Also that the world would soon bow to him and other typical idiot stuff. However, the idiot seemed to have forgotten about the artillery, which soon began to smash the much stronger fortifications to dust. However, soon a bright beam of light flashed out from the dormant volcano, and vaporized the 20th Siege Artillery Battalion, 50-20-90 pound, describing the weight of the rounds, cannons and 500 artillerymen, along with the majority of the IV Legio, 15,000 veteran legionaries, and 10,000 civilians. As soon as the light died down, the Imperial forces, currently being directed by Bertrand, started to evacuate the civilians left in the newer sections of the city. As this was going on, Naruto started channeling the chakra the Kyuubi left him before she left his seal permanently, into a menacing ball attack to destroy the entirety of the dead volcano. At the same time, Michael gathered together the members of Legio 10 to launch an assault on the walls, and as their liege fired his attack, which left no trace of the volcano or the super weapon that had been hidden within the volcano, they formed into testitos, literally like the tortoise, in which the legionaries locked their shields in such a way as to make arrow attacks near worthless, and marched forward. The automated arrow turrets that were left on the badly damaged wall fired as soon as the legionaries got in range, but to the horror of the daimyo, instead of causing death and destruction, the arrows merely bounced off the shields of the slowly advancing Imperials while the walls came crashing down due to more artillery rounds smashing into it. The cowardly daimyo fled back to his palace, though as soon as he saw the weapons were useless against the legionaries. Immediately after the walls crumbled, the elite legionaries and Michael charged straight into the gap opened by the bombardment, and swiftly conquered the old city. However, when they reached the palace itself, several hundred golems, in the guise of large multi-armed samurai, attacked. The legionaries fought well, but the golems were forged to be expert swordsmen, and as such the Imperial soldiers were falling slowly but surely under the blades of the golems. However, just when it looked like the legionaries would be forced to retreat, the cavalry quite literally rode to the rescue, led by Joan of Arc. The knights ripped through the metallic golems as if they were made of nothing but tissue paper, not only saving most of the legion from destruction but opening the way into the palace. However, the daimyo had one last trick up his sleeve, and when the first group of 200 legionaries entered the palace to arrest the daimyo, it activated a dozen explosive tags and 30 paper bombs detonating, reducing the soldiers to nothing more than chunks of meat with ruined fragments of armor still attached. At this final trick, Michael's, whose helmet had been blown off by the explosion, revealing to the world his visibly enraged features, anger exploded. To hell with the orders to take that fucker alive. He and his court will pay with their lives in retribution for this treachery. The nearest legionary smirked at his commander, Field Marshal. As far as all his legionaries are concerned, the fucker underestimated the power of the explosive charges and died from fragments of his palace hitting him. Michael smiled coldly at his subordinates. Thank you all, now I'm going in there and killing that son of a bitch. If anyone else tries and enters, delay them as much as possible without being disloyal to the Emperor. With his piece set, he slammed his helmet back on and began marching towards the throne room, with his armor shrugging off every blow that came his way due to his channeling chakra into his armor to enhance its strength. When he burst into the throne room, the fire daimyo walked down to greet him calmly and surrender, being used to that kind of warfare from the tales his father and grandfather told him. However, Michael would have none of it, and calmly declined the daimyo's surrender before bisected the fool and turning on and butchering the court in a blood rage. When he left the palace with his armor covered in blood and with bits of the flesh of his victims stuck to it, he was confronted by Naruto, who was glaring at him, as well as an appalled Joan and a grim-looking Bertrand. The Prussian aristocrat sighed heavily before speaking in a tired, but unrepentant, tone. I'm in trouble, aren't I? Naruto's sarcastic, you think? Was all the evidence he needed to loudly mutter, I need a drink. Konoha. Same time as the assault on Volcano City begins. All of Konoha had feared the worst when their advanced warning sensors discovered that a large force of Imperial troops were on their way to attack Konoha. Obviously this meant that the invasion of Blades had failed. As a consequence, not only was the Emperor free to strike back, but he was also more than likely pissed off. A fact that was reinforced when the Imperials completely encircled the city, and swiftly set up their artillery. Some within Konoha hoped that the Imperials would give them time to evacuate the civilians. However, their hope was dashed when the artillery opened fire. The Imperial artillery regiments that took part in this attack, unlike the ones that bombarded the capital, didn't care about collateral damage. As such, more often than not the shells fired by the batteries smashed into the residences on the other side of the wall. As such, it took 3 hours to smash the steel-reinforced walls down. However, by then interior of the city was in flames from the thousands of heated shots that smashed into the wooden buildings that made up the majority of the city. The defenders of Konoha formed as good a defensive position as they could. All things considered, however, they were more used to shinobi wars. As such, when they encountered the full might of the Empire that day, they were completely unprepared for what was to come. Before they had much time to fully solidify their positions, the mass formations of cavalry smashed into their lines, the sheer force being enough to knock out large portions of the front line. As soon as they finished their charge, the Imperial horsemen turned around and left Konoha. However, that was just a prelude to the real assault. Soon enough the Imperial forces advanced once again, with their archers firing at an arc into the city to cover their advance. Underneath the veritable storm of longbow fire, the Imperial infantry advanced in disciplined formations and chanting war songs to not only keep themselves psyched up but to intimidate their foes. As the two groups clashed, several groups stood out. The first was Team Ebisu, Konohamaru Moegi and Udon, led by Jonin Ebisu. Because of their teacher's incompetence, they were swiftly defeated and captured by a rookie squad of legionaries from the XX Legio. The Konoha 11 parents, who had reformed their old squads for this event, and unaware of the fact that their kids were alive but captured by the Empire of Blades. Sume Inuzuka, Shibi Aburame, and Dustin Higurashi as Team 25, Shuza Akamichi, Shikaku Nara, and Inoichi Yamanaka as Team 26. And Hiyashi Hyuga as the sole remaining member of Team Jiraiya. What was left of the old team had reformed as well. Kaharu and Homura were getting ready for battle, knowing that this may very well be their last battle. But calling upon whatever courage they had left shinobi, they decided to face their doom as best they could. The Hyuga clan, who had initially been at the very front lines of the fighting, had been pushed steadily back to their compound. The Hyuga had been understandably shocked when their vaunted style had done next to nothing to the advancing Imperial infantrymen, whose armor was nigh immune to their strikes. As such, a large percentage of the main and branch family fell dead at the blades of the legionaries or those of the halberdiers. The slaughter among the Hyuga was even worse because Sun Wukong was leading that contingent. Soon enough, though, Hiyashi strode forward to face Sun Wukong, who preferred to use his megaton staff but to be fair decided to fight Hiyashi using only taijutsu. And to a casual observer it seemed that they were equally skilled, but to those who were taijutsu experts, Sun had the advantage due to his unpredictability. As such, he was actually winning. This was surprising and angering Hiyashi to no end, since the arrogant Hyuga believed that their taijutsu style was unbeatable. Hiyashi kept lacing his blows with chakra to shut down the tenketsu in Sun Wukong's heart, but every time he struck him, Sun would dissolve into nothingness. This in turn would cause Sun to snort and laugh, taunting Hiyashi before jumping and slamming a foot into his face, knocking him back. The Hyuga head got up enraged, and started to use a Hyuga forbidden technique, the gentle fist meteor palm strike, which used fire chakra to not only shut down another's chakra network, but destroy it forever. This technique was forbidden because of this simple fact. It was a last resort jutsu. It had the power, but it burned one's chakra network to be unusable for several months, if not permanently, depending on how easily the user healed. Hiyashi's attack missed by a single millimeter, and that was all it took for his chakra network to burn out, leaving him vulnerable for Sun to knock him out cold, and take the proud clan head to where they would be holding all the captives. In the meantime, the Hyuga Elder Council was executed by a group of halberdiers for crimes against the emperor and basic human decency, and the rest of the clan, now only 40% of their size from before the assault, were forced to surrender and were taken to the internment camp outside the village. Among those captured was Hanabi Hyuga, who had lived up to her nickname of Firecracker by causing frustration for her foes before her capture. The Aburame and Inazuka clans were the next to be hit by the imperial battle line. The sheer number of imperial soldiers that fought against the two clans was forcing them to take drastic measures. Most of the Inazuka had already gone into the highest forms of their Niken's taijutsu style to even put a dent in their foe's armor. On the other hand, the Aburame had sent out several colonies of their insects to try and drain the Imperials, only to discover that their armor was too thick for their allies to affect them. As such, their main method of attack had been neutralized, and they were forced to use whatever limited other skills they had. However, unlike the Hyuga, who had persecuted Naruto when he was younger, the Inazuka and Aburame had been neutral to him, so the entirety of their clans were merely taken prisoner after realizing how futile their attacks were. While their clans were being humiliated, Sume and her team were facing off against Guan Ping and 6 dismounted knights. 2 of them were armed with 6-foot-long halberds and shields. 2 others were armed with massive sway-hander swords, and the other 2 were armed with long swords and shields, who were like nothing this team had ever faced. Sume's clothes had several tears in them, not in a way that would be perverted but a way that shows she is badly injured. At the moment, her partner Kuromaru was incapacitated after being hit in his jugular by the butt of a broadsword. Shibi was heaving and holding his bleeding side. A long deep gash could be seen under his armor. Dustin's weapons littered the battlefield. He had tried to use his personal jutsu, the Kunai Dragon Tank, which was a mass of kunai in the shape of a tank with a dragon's head for a cannon. But by the time he had even gotten most of his kunai out, he had been bashed in the skull by the shaft of a halberd. Sume went for one last attack, but before she could even go through the hand signs, she was incapacitated by Guan Ping. Shibi passed out from his wounds at the same time. After that, they were all taken to the internment camp behind imperial lines. The Ino Shikacho families were the last true line of defense that Konoha had, besides the Hokage and the decimated Anbu contingents, and they were swiftly losing ground to the unrelenting assault. Soon enough, though, the Imperials stopped, much to the shock of their foes. However, they soon learned why when a mounted knight arrived and issued an ultimatum. Either they surrendered to the Imperials, or their entire clan would be exterminated by the English longbowmen who had gotten into range of the trapped clans. There followed a short argument between the 3 clan heads, but they decided for the good of their clans that surrender was the better option. As such, the last 3 great clans of Konoha were brought down, not with a bang, but a whimper. But what of the Hokage, you may ask? What of Tsunade Senju, the Godemi Hokage? The truth of the matter would be hilarious if it weren't so sad. She was just waking up from the drunken stupor she had fallen into last night, and the only reason she was waking up at all was the messenger hawk pecking at her head. Tsunade, still not fully awake or aware of the war being waged in her village, read with missive several times before she understood what it meant, and when she did, she dropped it like it was burning her hands. The Empire had invaded, and was decimating the capital's defenses. However, before she could even start planning, an arrow smashed through the window, breaking the silencing seals and allowing her to hear the sounds of Konoha's fall. As soon as her brain registered what was happening, she sped out to the main square, where the last Anbu units were making their last stand. However, by the time she arrived, they had all been incapacitated by a woman wielding a 9-headed chain whip. The woman had an impassive face as she looked upon her work and the stunned Hokage. However, before the two could start fighting, in what Jiraiya would surely predict would result in at least partial nudity, a contingent of 500 Imperial soldiers from Legio I attacked Tsunade. Tsunade, even in her slightly impaired state, was still a force to be reckoned with. As the Imperials realized too late, she swiftly set about demolishing the group. Soon enough, a full fifth of the force had fell to her monstrous strength, either due to internal injuries, from being impaled on the fallen weapons, or being splattered on the buildings. It took her a full 15 minutes to finish off the detachment, whose broken forms littered the main square. However, before she could attack Genji, Antonio de Angelo arrived. The obvious aura of strength that the marshal projected turned Tsunade's recently awakened anger on him, more than likely saving Genji's life. Tsunade charged Antonio, with her fists at the ready, only to be stopped when a 3-foot-long baton smashed into her face before returning to her foe. The younger man smirked as he brought out a second baton, and applying a bit of chakra merged them into an X shape before channeling a bit more into the new formation, causing 4 1-foot-long Chinese glaive blades to appear to each end of this buzzsaw. The sight of such an exotic weapon was enough to send chills down Tsunade's spine, until she remembered that the X didn't have blades until he channeled chakra into it, meaning that he was still something of a novice with that weapon. However, the amount of time it took the Sannin to come to that conclusion was enough time for Antonio to use one of the seals on his weapon to blunt the blades. He had strict orders to take Tsunade alive, and to go on the offensive. To her credit, Tsunade reacted quickly, and only took a few hits from the blunted weapon. However, those hits struck with only slightly less force than her own strikes. And as such, she was obviously having a relatively hard time. She had scored several hits on Antonio, but he seemed to be enjoying himself immensely, as if pain was a thing he liked to receive, and easily shrugged the blows off. However, everything eventually comes to an end, and Tsunade was eventually hit one more time, this time on the skull. And before she lost consciousness, she heard Antonio say, "You should thank the Emperor that you're still alive. He told us to not kill unless it couldn't be avoided. You, however, Tsunade, he has strict orders to take alive. Be grateful that he has decided to show you mercy." And with those words ringing in her ears, she fell into blissful unconsciousness. As soon the fight was over and Tsunade taken to the camp, 3 legionnaires walked up with a young woman, about the same age as their emperor, and she looked frail and weak. Antonio walked forward and said, "Why did you bring me this young woman? She looks like she can barely stand up. You did not do anything that would make you regret it, did you?" His calm tone didn't betray the fact that as he said this, he was fingering a dagger he always kept on his person. The soldiers gulped and immediately shook their heads no. The leader of the small group then spoke up. "This is Yakumo Kurama. She suffers from a demon known as the Ito, that manifested in her mind. It makes her genjutsu more powerful and real. The cost of this power is her sanity. It can also take over her body and make her appearance demon-like. As seen when we were trying to apply a seal on her to stop the demon. She can learn to control it, but not among Konoha nin, since no one trained her, and her own clan disowned her and tried to kill her because of the Ito. She has expressed a desire to move to Blades, if the Emperor will have someone help her train in its powers." Antonio nodded, and told them to give her some rations and water since she looked so weak, and the legionnaires nodded and walked off with her. Several minor struggles continued through the day, civilian militia members and non-clan nins who were trying to just survive, with Konoha losing at every turn. The final moment of the Battle of Konoha was an act of kami. Several extremely powerful bolts of lightning fell from the sky and shattered the Hokage's monument, leaving only the Yondaimi's face intact, and it looked more stern and remorseful than it had ever seemed before. Up in Kami's realm, Minato Namikaze was laughing manically as he finished destroying all but his face on the mountain, so all of Konoha's inhabitants would see how disappointed he was with them. He then began plotting how to use the other 9 irrevocable favors he had won from the goddesses during poker last night. As he plotted, a lot of beings felt chills run up their spines. Back in Konoha, as the day ended and night fell upon the village, the Imperials moved their captives into the ruined remains of their former home, and set guards. They would remain until the Emperor arrived to do anything else with them. Meanwhile, Antonio was laying on his horse's back, thinking of his loving wife Sonia, aka Inquisitor Tyr, and wishing he could be lying next to her, but knew that once this was all over he would be asking for a month off for some free time.